인터뷰 배양숙의Q. 이 시대와 미래를 위한 인류 공헌에 앞장서고 있는 미네르바스쿨의 설립자 벤 넬슨 씨를 만납니다. 반갑습니다.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm curious.
I'm excited about being here.
I am a doctor in the making.
I'm here to explore the unknown.
All I know is this is where I want to be.
I'm here to get the single best education ever invented.
I'm here to develop myself in ways I can't even imagine.
This journey makes me feel grateful.
I am Brazilian.
I'm Israeli.
I'm from China.
I am Canadian.
We basically pushed the reset button. We said, it's 21st century. What can we do that's different, that hasn't been possible? So, from my point of view, content is a vehicle for teaching them tools they can use for the rest of their lives to keep adapting, keep learning, keep growing.
This was kind of my dream school. It felt like I dreamed how my ideal school would be, and then all of a sudden it existed.
I'm just unbelievably privileged to be in this position, to have these opportunities, to be a founder.
You look around at the other people and you feel like it's this unique combination of our minds will create the first layer of student body in Minerva.
It's hard to pick one, but if I could pick two, I think first and foremost, now that we have our first graduated class, we have seen how we can completely transform our students' lives. Take smart, high potential, driven students, but give them a set of tools to be able to analyze the world in very powerful ways, in ways that they couldn't get anywhere else. And the reaction that we've gotten from employers, from nonprofits, corporations, graduate programs, to our students has made us not only very gratified, but made us realize that what we're doing is a different kind of education. And the second, which is related, because of that, so many other universities and organizations, even corporations all over the world, have come to us and said, how can we also get some of that Minerva education for our students, for our employees? And that has occurred in dozens of countries all over the world. And it's been very gratifying to be able to see that. The very first graduates we had were from our master's program. They graduated in September of 2018, but there were only about 10 of them, so a very, very small number. And they've gone on to do very interesting things. We have one master's graduate who went and worked at a startup in a very high capacity and is doing extraordinarily well. He's from Bulgaria. We have an Israeli graduate who is an artist and combines computational thinking with her art. And I've now been to 3 of her openings, major art shows all over the world, in the United States, in Israel. She worked in Berlin, etc. And so that has been extremely gratifying. We have one of our graduates who became a White House Fellow, which is in the United States, in a very prestigious, very difficult to attain position, which is somebody who really works at the most interesting problems at the government that they try to solve. Our first undergraduate class graduated just this past May, and May of 2019. And that group is a little bit larger. It's about 106 undergraduates. And the results from that class has been astonishing. To give you some perspective, we had 3 students apply for postgraduate work in Harvard University. All 3 were accepted. One of them actually turned Harvard down to pursue a PhD in another prestigious university. We had 2 students interested in pursuing graduate degrees in physics. One went to get a master's degree in Cambridge, one went to get a PhD with a Nobel Prize winner at the University of California at Berkeley. We had one student who wasn't sure if he wanted to do a computer science PhD or a master's in international relations. So he applied to the top 2 programs for his interest, one in each, and decided to see who would accept him, and that's what he would do. Turns out that when he applied to the Fletcher School for International Relations, the top program in the world, and the University of Chicago for computer science with the professor that he was most interested in working with in the world, he was accepted to both. And so he convinced both institutions to let him take the master's and the PhD together, even though one is in Chicago and one is in Boston. And so these are just the graduate school examples. We have 3 students who graduated who were co-founders of funded startups, one of which has already raised more than $5 million in the market. And there's an enormous amount of personal success in that regard. We have students that have gone on to get positions that would be equivalent to Ivy League graduates after 3, 4, sometimes 5 years after they graduate, but just at graduation. So we've been very gratified with those results. I think that if you look at the nature of work today, a lot of people tend to think about the future as being dramatically different than today is. And I would actually argue that the big shift occurred about 30 years ago with the end of the Cold War, the rise of the internet, the greater globalization and international trade and interconnectedness. And so what you've seen happen since 1989, when the Berlin Wall collapsed, was a change in the nature of society. People work in global enterprises. Here, you're having a conversation with somebody who lives in San Francisco, who created a university that educates students from all over the world, that then travel to different parts of the world, and then integrate with local cultures, corporations, governments, etc. That kind of program would have been unthinkable 35 years ago. It's too hard to even imagine what that would have been like, but it exists today. It doesn't need to exist in the future, it happens today. The people who work at Minerva are oftentimes doing jobs they never thought they'd be able to do before. Professors who teach at Minerva, even though they were professors at other universities before, teach in ways that they couldn't even imagine, right? With technology and a whole bunch of algorithmic thinking or algorithms in the embedded environment in which they teach. The staff members are facing challenges they never faced in other parts of their career. And so that dynamic of jobs that didn't exist before or the changing nature of work has been with us now for a long time. It's just that the educational system hasn't caught up to that need. And so when we create an educational system that is specifically designed for today's world, you don't have to think about, will it be useful in the future? The reason that our students, our graduates, get such great placements, the reason they're in such high demand compared to the graduates of the other top universities in the world, is that the needs exist now, not sometime in the future. So I actually wouldn't claim that this is a vision. I think this is just my ability to look around and see reality. A lot of what we just talked about before, thinking about how the world will become more automated and, all of the turmoil that people think about in the world, when you think about it as a future event, in the future, jobs will disappear. In the future, we'll have all of these different careers by the time we retire. In the future, we will have to reskill ourselves all the time. That sounds scary. That sounds like as if I don't know what's going to happen. But the reality is, because it's the world we already live in, that we're used to it. We're used to having, and we've seen jobs just vanish. Imagine the number of people 35 years ago who had to do word processing, who had to use typewriters, right, in order to type things up. Those people are gone, right? It just doesn't, that entire class of individuals is gone. Telephone operators, gone, right? There's so many jobs that have just been destroyed by automation, yet unemployment is quite low in many ways, right? And so innovation creates more jobs in that regard. The big difference is that the world, if you look at the big difference about the world that we're already living in compared to the world in the past, and what the education system isn't ready for, is the speed and complexity of the world, and then how quickly we move from context to context, right? And so if you think about the world of the past, it moved slowly, right? Big events that occurred halfway around the world took weeks for people in the other half of the world to even know about, and it had almost no impact on them. Whereas today, when an event occurs, reaction is immediate. People don't have weeks, they don't have days, they sometimes don't even have hours. They have to process enormous amounts of data, different factors that they have to think about, and make decisions almost instantly. This is a crushing demand on what is fundamentally a trained mind that would be comfortable 2,000 years ago, right? So if you go and take somebody from even the 19th century and have them start to work at the pace that we are working in, they wouldn't know what to do. Now, the difference is we're used to that speed, but we're not used to actually making good decisions in that speed. And this is one of the failings of education. The second is that because the world is so complex, you have to understand and be comfortable with many different areas, many different cultures, many different environmental contexts that may be separated only by a few minutes. And so to be able to not only think in systematic ways to deal with the complexity of the issue, but also to be able to apply these thinking tools across different contexts is crucial. And those two problems are the key problems that Minerva addresses and that other universities have never really figured out. Yeah, I think that the general approach that we have at Minerva is to think about what are the tools that we need to build in order to enable the learning of other tools in that way. And what Stephen contributed to the Minerva model was crucial, because he took the ideas that I had on curricular design and all the rest, and he married that with the science of learning, with how the brain actually works. And so the techniques that he developed to ensure that students not only get the curriculum that we designed, but more importantly, that they retain it and that they're able to then apply it from one context to another, like we talked about before, is crucial. And so how do we do it? You understand that in order for the mind, for the person, to be able to remember information, they can't just hear it. They have to deeply think about it, right? And they can do that in one of two ways. They can either marinate, meaning that they can spend time with an idea, thinking about various aspects of what it means and how to apply it, or they can start to make and use associations with that concept. So they can tie it to something else that they are familiar with, and therefore also think it through on a deep basis. And so those broader principles actually have 16 underlying principles from the science of learning. And what Stephen did was take those 16 principles and shape our pedagogical methodologies to meet all of those needs, which has been an amazing, amazing feat. First time that's ever been done in history where the science of learning has actually been at the heart of the design of an educational system. If you think about most startups or most new initiatives, what happens? Somebody has a thesis, they have an idea, and they were to say, oh, I'd like to see something occur. And so let's try an approach. And they come up with an approach and they launch it, and then they see how the market reacts to it. So sometimes they like the way the approach is, sometimes they don't, sometimes they like one aspect but another, and so they change and iterate depending on what their end users would like to see. That is a typical process for startups, as you well know. In education, that approach doesn't work. It doesn't work first and foremost because when you're trying to educate someone, they don't know what's good for them. That's your job as an educator. If they knew, they wouldn't need you, right? And so obviously that's one problem. Second problem is that education doesn't occur instantly. It takes time. And so for an education to actually develop, you have to have a long amount of time to see results and outcomes. And so even if you were to wait and then iterate, it would take so long to iterate somewhere on a holistic basis. Sure, in small areas it's easy, but in a big basis, that it would be too late to actually do anything about it, at least to get to a good answer. And then lastly, perceptions in education are oftentimes the opposite of reality. I'll give you some examples. It turns out that if you measure learning outcomes for a professor, right? So a professor teaches a group of students, those outcomes are inversely correlated with their teacher evaluations. So that means the more that students like a professor, the less they learn from them, right? And so that's fascinating because most universities will look at teacher evaluations when they do and say, oh, you were a good teacher because the students liked you. Turns out the students like bad professors. They may like funny professors, but not effective ones, right? And so that's a fascinating feature. I'll give you another example. Students, when asked whether or not they like passive learning environments, lectures, or active learning environments where they have to do the work, so students, when asked whether or not they like passive learning environments or learn more in passive learning environments versus active learning environments, they say that in a lecture-based environment, which is passive learning, they feel like they learn much more than in an active learning environment. When you actually measure how much they learn 7 times more in an active learning than a passive learning. And so all of these things mean that in education, a typical approach to launch and learn isn't sufficient when you do the design of the institution. So what do? You have to reference what we know about what works in training the mind. We have an enormous amount of research, the same research I just quoted, for example, on what works versus what doesn't, that comes from decades of looking at output. And then you design a system to incorporate that research. If you were to have a conversation with me 8 years ago, I didn't have a single student at Minerva, I didn't have a single faculty member, I didn't have a single employee. It was just me coming up with the design of the institution. I would have told you, we would have students from all over the world. They would be in small cohort that would be able to meet everybody in that cohort and establish deep personal connections and friendships. They would go through a small seminar-based class using online technologies that have live video in which they would process their information in a very deep way. They would live in 7 different countries around the world during their 4 years of getting an accredited degree. Their core curriculum would consist of 4 cornerstone courses that would take the entire first year and would teach them how to think critically or understand formal systems, how to understand empirical systems for creative thinking, how to understand complex systems or the interactions between individuals and systems, and how to understand rhetorical systems or how we communicate. All of those things were true in the initial design of the institution, and they're exactly the same as they are today. Now, the approach, what we did, the minutiae, which 7 of the 7 cities around the world they would live in, all of that has changed, and we've learned after we launched in that respect. So we iterate and make everything better at the small scale, but from the holistic design, we had to get it right from the beginning. We talked a little bit about the broad systems that the students learn. For example, formal systems, which is things like statistical analysis, logic, reasoning, algorithmic thinking. That's what we more often call critical thinking skills. Now, critical thinking is actually not really a thing. It's a combination of different things. And so there are different kinds of critical thinking. For example, making a decision to interview one person versus another. That's a kind of critical thinking. Should I spend my time interviewing person A or person B? Now, the tools that you need to make that decision, should I interview person A versus person B, is very different than the tools you need to evaluate the claims that one of these people may make, right? And so you have to then understand, well, what are those underlying tools? So for example, if you wanted to decide, should I interview one person or another, you may think about a cost-benefit analysis. Here would be what would be involved in preparing for an interview with person A, but then here would be the reward that I would get for interviewing that person. Viewers' interest, whether or not it would break news, it would say something interesting, etc. Versus in evaluating claims, you may actually look at it from a completely different tool set. Rather than thinking about a decision trade-off, because it's not a decision to make, you're just evaluating something, you could say, well, does that claim make sense? Sometimes it can make sense, but the statistics behind it seem to be wrong, right? So these are different tools that you can use. Each one of these tools is either a habit of mind, something that you train your brain to do automatically, or a foundational concept, a piece of practical knowledge that you build upon. And so you don't train your brain automatically, you actually have to think about how to apply it. And in order to be able to master the application of them, not just the theory of them, you have to apply them in different contexts. So you apply statistical analysis to a claim of some scientific claim in a research paper. And then you apply the same statistical analysis to a claim that a government official is making about the impact of a policy. And then you apply some form of statistical analysis, potentially, to an interpersonal argument or bet that you have with somebody else. Similarly, you can think of decision trade-offs as what do you do in a professional context, like who do you interview? You can think about decision trade-offs as to how you think about which home to purchase, right? You can think about decision trade-offs, right? Or cost-benefit analyses in how you actually spend time and energy with certain friends versus others, or trade off between spending your time with family, work, or friends. each one of these cost-benefit analyses is very different in the contexts. The variables you will look at are going to be very, very different from one another, but the techniques are the same. And that's why habits and concepts need to be practiced over and over and over again.